They mocked her soft hands, laughed in her face, filmed her like a joke. But 30 seconds later, a blindfolded woman did what no one saw coming. She disarmed a trained soldier without saying a word. This wasn't luck. This was Navy SEAL-level precision hidden beneath silence. Stay with us, because what she did next didn't just change the room, it changed the entire base. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing and let us know where you're listening from. The first thing Staff Sergeant Henry Brooks noticed wasn't her face. It was her hands. Too clean, too smooth, too soft. On a rain-soaked Friday night at Fort Mason Ridge, the mess hall of Delta Company buzzed with the usual noise: plastic trays slamming down, boots scraping tile, laughter born from boredom and ego. Then Brooks scoffed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Look at those hands," he said, pointing. "Those aren't soldier hands, those are office hands." Laughter rippled through the room. Standing alone near the serving line was Anya Maddox. She was smaller than most of them, calm, still. Her uniform fit perfectly, yet somehow made her stand out even more. Auburn hair pulled tight, eyes lowered, no rank visible, no reaction given. To the room, she looked fragile, out of place, an easy target. Lieutenant Grace Whitmore smirked. "Did someone forget to tell you this isn't a wellness retreat?" Phones slowly came out. Mockery always played better on video. But from the far corner, Captain Lucas Ward watched in silence. He wasn't looking at her hands. He was watching her breathing, her balance, the way she stood relaxed yet ready. Ward had seen that stillness before. Not in trainees, not in officers. Only in people who had learned very early how to survive violence without showing it. And suddenly, he knew. They weren't laughing at a civilian. They were mocking someone who had been trained to end fights before they even began. The laughter didn't stop. In fact, it grew bolder. Once Staff Sergeant Henry Brooks realized Anya Maddox wasn't reacting, wasn't crying, wasn't snapping back, he mistook her silence for weakness. That was his first mistake. He stepped closer, invading her space, his shadow swallowing her frame. "You hear us talking about you, right?" he said loudly. "Those hands wouldn't last 10 seconds in a real fight. You ever even held a weapon, or do you just type reports all day?" More laughter, louder now. Someone clapped, someone whistled. Anya lowered her gaze, fingers interlaced in front of her. They really were soft. No calluses, no scars, no visible proof of the violence she had lived through. To them, that meant everything. To Captain Lucas Ward, it meant nothing. Ward leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. He noticed the way her weight subtly shifted, not backward, but centered, balanced, ready. Grace Whitmore joined Brooks, her tone dripping with polished cruelty. "Come on, Sergeant, don't scare her," she said. "She's probably here for a tour or a diversity photo op." She turned to Anya. "Sweetheart, do you even know what unit this is?" Anya nodded faintly. "Yes, ma'am." That was it. 2 words, calm, even. It irritated Brooks more than defiance ever could. "Oh, she talks." He said, "All right then. Let's see what those soft hands can do." He turned and barked, "Rhodes, bring me a sidearm." Corporal Dylan Rhodes hesitated just a fraction, but followed the order. He cleared the weapon, checked it twice, then placed it on the metal table between Brooks and Anya. Brooks slid it toward her with one finger. "Field strip it," he said. 30 seconds. If you can't, you walk out of here and don't come back." Phones came up instantly. This was no longer teasing. This was humiliation, broadcast ready. Anya stared at the weapon for a long second. Then she reached for it. The moment her fingers touched the frame, something changed. Her hands didn't tremble. They moved. Fast, precise, economical. Slide, barrel, recoil spring, frame. Each part separated cleanly, laid out in perfect order. No wasted motion, no hesitation. The laughter faltered. At 15 seconds, the weapon was already disassembled. Anya began reassembling. "Click, lock, snap." She set the sidearm back on the table and stepped away. 27 seconds, she said quietly. No one spoke. Brooks stared at the gun as if it had betrayed him. Grace Whitmore's smile froze mid-expression. Someone in the back muttered, "No way." But Brooks wasn't finished. His pride wouldn't allow it. "Beginner's luck," he snapped. "You memorize a YouTube video and think you're special." He leaned in again. "Let's raise the stakes." He gestured toward the weapons rack behind the counter. "M4, training rifle." That caused murmurs. Even Rhodes stiffened. Sergeant Rhodes began. "Now," Brooks barked. The rifle hit the table with a heavy clang. Brooks folded his arms. 18 seconds is the base record? Beat it, and I'll admit you're not just some clerk playing soldier." Anya didn't respond. She stepped forward. The rifle came apart in her hands like it was an extension of her body. Upper receiver, bolt carrier group, charging handle, buffer spring. 8 seconds. A few soldiers swore under their breath. She reassembled it without looking at anyone. 16 seconds. Silence pressed down on the room like weight. Captain Ward's fingers brushed the concealed mic in his collar. "Advanced weapons proficiency confirmed," he murmured under his breath. "Not conventional training." Brooks swallowed, then lashed out with questions. "Effective range. 550-point target, 600 area. Combat trauma kit." Anya answered without pause. "Danger close protocol." Flawless. Every word landed like a hammer. And then unexpectedly, Private Eli Monroe stepped forward. "Sergeant," he said, voice tight, "maybe we should stop." Brooks turned slowly. "What did you say?" "I said maybe we're crossing a line." Grace scoffed. "Oh, please, you falling for her act too." Eli shook his head. "She hasn't bragged once, hasn't insulted anyone, and she's outperformed all of us." Anya looked at him then. Just briefly. In her eyes was something ancient. Not gratitude. Recognition. Because she knew what came next. And so did Captain Ward. They had mocked her soft hands. They had tested her patience. And very soon, they were going to learn what those hands were trained to take away. The room should have gone back to normal. But it didn't. No one returned to their meals. No one laughed. The air in the mess hall was heavy thick with something none of them could name. Respect. Fear. Whatever it was, it made the laughter from earlier feel like echoes from a different lifetime. Staff Sergeant Henry Brooks looked like a man on the edge of something he didn't understand. He folded his arms tighter, as if holding his authority in place with sheer muscle. Across from him, Anya Maddox stood quietly, hands behind her back, breathing steady. No arrogance, no smirk, just stillness. And somehow, that unsettled him even more. "Fine," Brooks said, his voice quieter now but sharper. "You're good. I'll give you that." He paused. Then his eyes narrowed. "But let's see how good—" He stepped toward the center of the room and pulled a black silk cloth from his pocket, the kind used in night training exercises. He dangled it in the air like a magician about to perform a trick. "You seem confident. Let's see you do it blindfolded." The room stirred. Someone whispered, "He's not serious." He was... Brooks tossed the blindfold onto the table in front of her like a dare. The entire mess hall held its breath. Anya didn't move. She didn't speak. She just looked down at the cloth, then picked it up. And without a word, she tied it over her eyes. The moment the knot tightened behind her head, a strange hush fell across the room. Even the buzzing overhead lights seemed to dim. Then Brooks did something no one expected. He pulled his own sidearm, a standard issue, freshly cleaned, and handed it to Corporal Dylan Rhodes. "Load it, safety on." Rhodes hesitated. "Sergeant, are you sure?" "Do it." He loaded the weapon, safety engaged, then set it on the table, hands trembling slightly. Brooks turned to Anya. "You're going to pick up that weapon, identify its status, clear it, and hand it back. All blindfolded." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "This is where your soft hands fail." Captain Lucas Ward didn't move, but his jaw tightened. He tapped his collar mic once. "Recording live. If she disarms, this changes everything." Anya stepped forward slowly. She reached out, fingertips grazing the weapon on the table, not fumbling, but scanning. In one fluid motion, she picked it up, turned it sideways, and felt the tension in the slide. She ejected the magazine with her thumb, then pulled the slide back to check the chamber. Empty. She dropped the slide, clicked the safety off, and without warning turned directly toward Brooks. The move was too fast to track. She stepped into him, twisted her body, and with a blur of motion disarmed him. Her palm slapped his wrist, her other hand stripped the holster clean before he realized what was happening. He staggered back. Anya took a half step forward, pressed the now cleared weapon flat against his chest, and said, through the blindfold. Safety was still off. She stepped back, removed the blindfold, set both weapons on the table, and returned to her original position, calm, silent, hands folded behind her back. 15 seconds. The silence that followed didn't feel like awe. It felt like shock. Private Eli Monroe's mouth hung open. Rhodes looked like he'd seen a ghost. Grace Whitmore's face had gone pale, and her phone, raised halfway through the stunt, lowered with a trembling hand. Brooks didn't speak. Couldn't, because somewhere deep in his instincts, he finally understood what they'd been toying with. This wasn't a woman playing soldier. This wasn't even a regular operative. This was Tier 1 level training, muscle memory refined through fire, blindfolded combat weapon status identification that wasn't YouTube. That was Navy SEAL. Ward stood from his seat and spoke for the first time. "Get me confirmation," he said into the mic. "Pull black file records, cross-reference Maddox Anya, any alias, any ghost op clearance. I want everything." And then, to himself, "She's not one of us." He stared across the room at the woman they mocked, who now stood in total control without saying a single threatening word. "She's beyond us." And just like that, the base wasn't laughing anymore. They were reevaluating everything. No one moved. No one even breathed too loudly. The mess hall at Fort Mason Ridge, once alive with laughter, cheap shots, and jeering pride, had transformed into a church, not one of faith, but one of reckoning. And at the center of it all stood Anya Maddox. Still, silent, undefeated. Staff Sergeant Henry Brooks hadn't spoken since she handed him back his own weapon cleared, safety engaged, eyes still covered. It wasn't the disarmament that broke him. It was the fact that she had never once raised her voice. She hadn't celebrated, hadn't mocked him, hadn't claimed victory. She'd simply executed like it was just another Tuesday. That terrified him more than if she had flipped the table and declared war. Grace Whitmore backed up slowly toward the coffee station, as if trying to pretend she'd never been part of the act. But the blood had drained from her face, and her eyes never left Anya. She whispered, "No way, she's just an analyst." Private Eli Monroe stood the way people do when they've just witnessed something sacred or dangerous. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with realization. They hadn't just misjudged her. They had revealed themselves. Captain Lucas Ward approached slowly, his hands visible, posture unthreatening. There was no rank between them now, no authority, only one operative recognizing another. "Who trained you?" he asked, his voice low. Anya's reply was calm. "Does it matter?" Ward studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "No, I suppose it doesn't." But the rest of the room needed more. They needed answers. Because in their minds, civilians don't do this. Academics don't blindfold disarm active soldiers. Soft hands don't belong to killers. Brooks cleared his throat. It was the first sound he'd made in minutes. I didn't know." Anya turned her head slightly in his direction, not a glare, not pity, just observation. The way someone trained to assess threats would observe a collapsing bridge. "I know," she said softly, and it landed harder than a scream. Because she wasn't gloating. She was telling the truth. She knew. She knew they'd mock her. She knew they'd underestimate her. And she had let it happen. That's what broke them. Not her skill, but her control. She could have stopped the humiliation at any moment, but chose to endure it, absorb it, use it. Because she hadn't come here to prove herself. She came to watch them reveal themselves. Whitmore tried to recover. "Tactical officers run drills like that all the time," she offered weakly. "Doesn't mean she's ghost tier." Captain Ward stepped in sharply. "Ghost tier operators don't run drills like that. They are the drill." He faced the room now, voice louder. "I've seen Tier 1 operatives under black flag protocols. I've worked alongside deep cover agents and SEALs that don't officially exist. What we saw here tonight isn't trained." He pointed to Anya. "It's embedded, it's who she is." The soldiers looked at her again, but this time with new eyes. She hadn't disguised herself as one of them. She had descended into their ranks to measure them. Eli Monroe finally found his voice. "Why are you here?" he asked. Anya turned toward him. For the first time, something softened in her expression. "To see what happens," she said, "when no one thinks they'll be held accountable." The silence that followed was heavy. Not because of guilt, at least not yet, but because they all knew she wasn't done. She was building to something. "I've walked into bases like this all over the world," she continued, "and it's always the same. Power with no integrity, pride with no accountability, strength confused for cruelty." She looked at Brooks, then at Whitmore. "No chain of command can fix what ego rots from within, so they send people like me." Captain Ward nodded once. "Ghost protocol." Someone gasped. The name itself was barely spoken out loud even within classified circles. It wasn't just a designation. It was a sentence. Ghost protocol meant evaluation, dismantling, cultural reconstruction from the inside. Anya looked around. "I didn't come to fight you," she said. "I came to see who you are when no one's watching, and I've seen enough." Then, calmly, "In 48 hours, this base will begin its audit under ghost supervision. Every command, every locker, every officer. You're not being punished, you're being weighed." She turned toward Monroe. "You spoke when it mattered. That'll be remembered." She turned to Brooks. "You hid behind your rank. That too will be remembered." And finally, she faced the room. "You mocked my hands. You assumed they were weak. But I want you to understand something very clearly." She raised both palms slowly, like a teacher addressing a class. "These hands have broken bones in 8 countries. They've stopped bleeding in 7. They've carried the wounded and pulled the trigger when no one else could." She let that hang in the air, then dropped her hands to her sides. "I was trained not to be seen, but now that you've seen me, what will you become?" And with that, Anya Maddox turned and walked out of the mess hall. No one followed. No one dared. Because suddenly, they weren't looking at a woman anymore. They were looking at the consequence. The mess hall remained silent long after Anya Maddox disappeared into the corridor. No one dared speak first. It felt like breaking the silence would break the spell, and none of them were ready to return to who they were before. Some stared at the doorway. Others stared at the floor. But Private Eli Monroe stared at his hands. The same hands that had trembled when he stood up to Staff Sergeant Brooks. The same hands that had itched to stay silent, to survive the moment without stepping into it. And yet, he did. He still didn't know why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was his grandfather's voice in the back of his mind. Maybe it was just the truth. Across the room, Captain Lucas Ward broke the silence. "Everyone stay seated." It wasn't a command. It was something gentler, something few of them had ever heard from a commanding officer before. Then the double doors opened again. But this time, it wasn't Anya Maddox. It was 2 soldiers in matte black uniforms, faces unreadable, steps in perfect sync. Their shoulders bore no insignia, but the dragon tattoo, half black, half white, was visible on the inside of their wrists. Ghost Division. They didn't speak. They didn't salute. They simply walked to the center of the room and opened a small black case. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a single item. A coin. Flat, heavy, blackened steel. Etched with 2 dragons, one biting the tail of the other, forming a perfect loop. The room stared at it like it might explode. Captain Ward stepped forward, took the coin, and walked directly toward Monroe. The young private stood quickly, instinctively at attention, like his body was responding faster than his brain. Ward stopped inches from him. "You didn't speak to be heard," he said. "You spoke because no one else would." He held up the coin. "This is not a medal. It won't get you promoted, and it won't protect you." Then his tone softened. "But it will remind you." He placed the coin in Monroe's hand and closed his fingers around it. "That when the room laughed, you stood. When rank barked, you questioned, and when power tested silence, you chose truth." Monroe's throat tightened. He couldn't even say thank you. Ward turned to the rest of the mess hall. "This is the start," he said, "of something new." He nodded toward the door. "In 48 hours, Fort Mason Ridge will begin its full audit. Cultural realignment, leadership restructuring, Ghost Command will monitor every level." Groans rippled quietly. Not in protest, but in guilt. They'd been exposed, every one of them. Grace Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Captain Ward's voice sharpened just slightly. "You'll be evaluated, not condemned. You'll be given a choice. Rise or step aside." He looked directly at Brooks, who still hadn't moved since being disarmed. "Some of you will struggle with that." Ward then turned back to Monroe. "You're no longer a private." The young man blinked. "What?" "Effective immediately," Ward said, handing him a folded document. "You're being elevated to the leadership integrity track under Ghost mentorship." Monroe's hands shook as he opened the paper. It was real. The coin was real. The opportunity, real. "Why me?" he asked softly. "I didn't do that much." Ward smiled faintly. "That's what makes you dangerous." Then, from the back of the room, a voice spoke, dry, hoarse, and unexpectedly familiar. "Staff Sergeant Brooks." "She played us all," he said, his voice low. Everyone turned. She knew exactly what she was doing, walked in here like prey, and left like a ghost. No one interrupted. Brooks looked at Monroe, then back at the empty space where Anya had stood. "I thought I understood strength. I thought it looked like volume, like muscle, like fear." He shook his head. But it looked like her. He stepped forward slowly, awkwardly, like a man learning how to walk in a new world. And for the first time in his career, he saluted a private. "Correction, a former private." Monroe stared for a second, then returned the gesture. The room didn't erupt in applause. There were no cheers. Just silence. Because something sacred had shifted. Respect wasn't about rank anymore. It was about how you showed up when it mattered. And everyone had just seen what that looked like. A door creaked open behind them. This time, it wasn't a ghost. It was a future they hadn't expected, and one they no longer feared. 3 days had passed. Fort Mason Ridge was no longer the same. The coffee still tasted burnt, the mess hall still echoed with boots and trays, but something invisible had shifted, something deeper than silence, something heavier than guilt. It wasn't fear. It was reflection. And nowhere was that more visible than inside the base chapel, where Staff Sergeant Henry Brooks sat alone beneath a stained glass window, staring at the new plaque mounted just above the altar. 2 dragons, one black, one white, intertwined in perfect balance. The Ghost Division symbol. His fists clenched at his sides, not out of anger, but out of memory. He could still feel the weight of the pistol Anya Maddox had handed back to him, cleared, safe, cold. He could still hear her voice, steady and emotionless. Safety was still off. That moment had shattered him, not because he lost a challenge, but because he lost the illusion. For years, he'd built a reputation on being the loudest, the hardest, the immovable wall. But Anya hadn't climbed over the wall. She'd walked right through it. And now, he was left sitting in the rubble, not stripped of rank, but stripped of certainty. He'd been ordered to report daily to the new Ghost Protocol liaison team, not for punishment, not for reassignment. For something worse. Rehabilitation. He wasn't a bad leader, but he had been a blind one. Now, every morning, he sat in silence for 10 minutes before speaking. That alone felt like its own kind of warfare. He thought of Eli Monroe, of how a 19-year-old private had shown more spine than a decorated sergeant. And instead of envy, he felt grateful. Across the compound, in the old intel briefing room, now repurposed as a training wing for emotional intelligence, Lieutenant Grace Whitmore stood before a group of 20 fresh recruits. She wore the same uniform, the same boots, the same perfect bun. But something about her had softened subtly, but unmistakably. Leadership, she said, isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about being the first to protect the quietest. The room was quiet. Then a young cadet female, maybe 18, raised her hand timidly. "Ma'am, is it true what they say about her, that she let it happen? That she..." Staged it? Whitmore didn't answer right away. She walked to the whiteboard behind her, drew a single circle with two halves, one black, one white, then turned back to the class. She didn't let it happen, she said finally. She orchestrated it, with terrifying precision. The cadets stared. She didn't need to prove anything to us, Whitmore continued. She was there to reveal something in us. She looked at her own reflection in the window beside her. And what I saw in myself that night, I'll spend the rest of my career undoing. Back at the chapel, Brooks reached into his pocket. Inside was a note folded, creased at the edges. Anya had left it in his locker. There was no signature. Just two sentences. You weren't born that way. You were taught to bark, now teach them to listen. He hadn't shown it to anyone, not yet. But every time his voice started to rise now during drills, briefings, lectures, he stopped himself, sometimes mid-word, and when the recruits asked why, he told them this. There's power in stillness, but it takes courage to stand inside it. He didn't tell them whose words those were. He didn't have to, because every single one of them had seen the footage. They'd all watched the recording now classified as internal training footage, G-113, the blindfolded disarm, the challenge, the control, the silence. They'd seen what it meant to be elite, to be ghost tier. But what stuck with them most wasn't the tactics. It was that she never raised her voice. On the wall outside the new Leadership Integrity Office, there's a quote etched into steel. The room mocked her. She didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She just waited for the truth to finish speaking. It's not credited, but every soldier at Fort Mason Ridge knows who it belongs to. Anya Maddox. And while she may be gone again off to another assignment, another evaluation, another silent battle, her presence lingers in the way people now hold themselves accountable, in the way drills are led, in the way promotions are earned, in the way silence is no longer feared, but respected. Because once you've stood in the presence of someone who let you mock her just to show you who you are, you never walk the same again. 3 months later, Fort Mason Ridge no longer looked the same. The buildings hadn't changed, the fences still stood, the boots still hit pavement at 500 sharp, but something in the air and the way people walked, spoke, stood was different. The jokes were still told, but never at someone else's expense. Orders were still given, but without humiliation. Corrections were still made, but with purpose, not pride. The change hadn't come from a memo. It had come from a ghost. Anya Maddox had only stayed 72 hours after the night everything broke open. No press, no ceremony, no briefing. She met once with Colonel Jacobs, once with the Ghost Division's internal auditors, and once privately with Eli Monroe, the former private who had dared to speak up when no one else would. She handed him a second coin. No speech, just a whisper. The first was for standing, this one's for carrying others. And then, she was gone. No records of departure. No flight log. No forwarding command. Just like before. Just like always. But what she left behind, that stayed. In the center of the newly renovated training compound stands a 12-foot black stone pillar. Smooth. Unpolished. Untouched by rank or ribbon. At its top, etched in silver, 2 dragons interlocked, one white, one black. Below that, only 5 words. She stood, so we changed. No name, because legends don't need them. Colonel Jacobs, once known for his impatience with soft initiatives, now led the country's first mandatory ethical resilience leadership program, modeled directly after the Ghost Protocol principles Anya had embodied. When asked by a military journalist why he never spoke her name publicly, Jacobs simply replied, because she didn't leave it behind. She left a standard. Lieutenant Grace Whitmore, now reassigned to command the Emotional Fitness Corps, opened every officer candidate seminar with the same 3-minute clip. A woman, blindfolded, standing in a room full of skeptics, calm hands, fast hands, disarming a loaded weapon in a loaded room in under 15 seconds. And when the footage ended, she'd ask the same question. What did she say? Most cadets would hesitate. Some would answer nothing. But Whitmore would correct them. She didn't say nothing. She said everything. and she did it without raising her voice. And then there was Eli Monroe. Now Corporal Monroe, selected into Ghost Division's Cultural Mentorship Program, a path few even knew existed. He still stuttered, sometimes, still looked down when thinking. But when new recruits lined up on day one and someone whispered, "That's the guy from the Maddox incident," he never corrected them, because it wasn't his incident. It was hers. The day the monument was unveiled, it rained. Of course it did. Dozens stood in uniform, caps soaked, faces lifted toward the sky. No speeches. No cameras. Just silence. The kind that says, "We were wrong, and we're ready to be better." One by one, soldiers walked to the base of the pillar and placed small tokens. Dog tags. Unit patches. Letters folded small. A way of saying, "You changed me," without ever asking to. That night, as the clouds cleared and the base lights dimmed, a single figure stood alone beneath the monument. Brooks, no longer barking, no longer needing to. He stood with hands behind his back, staring up at the dragons. And for the first time, he didn't feel small beneath them. He felt grounded. And when he finally turned to walk away, he whispered, "She didn't strip us down. She showed us what we'd buried." In the world of uniforms and ranks, of medals and citations, of barking orders and stone-faced salutes, Anya Maddox left behind no decoration, only a mirror, and those brave enough to look into it. They changed, not because she told them to, not because she ordered it, but because she let them see who they had become, and then reminded them of who they could be. Anya Maddox's story isn't just about ranked tactics or elite training. It's about a kind of strength the world often underestimates. The quiet kind. The still kind. The kind that doesn't show off but shows up. She walked into a room full of people who mocked her, doubted her, tried to reduce her to a joke. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She let the truth unfold on its own timeline. And when it did, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard because real power doesn't need to bark. Real leadership doesn't need to threaten. It simply acts with discipline and restraint. And when that kind of strength is revealed, it silences everything else. If this story spoke to you, subscribe and hit the bell. More quiet strength is coming. Share it with someone who's ever been underestimated. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.